Hello and welcome to the Storied Arcs podcast, where we do deep dive looks into indie and creator-owned comics. And today we have another very special exclusive interview with Will Morris. You may know him from his writing of the book Gospel. If not, you might know him from his art in the work Gospel. You might know him from his color in the work Gospel or his lettering in the work Gospel. Basically, if you're in the American market, Gospel is the primary thing you will have seen him in. And he did this one-man project, 5 issues through Image Comics. We've already discussed it last week. And without any further ado, we're going to ask all of the questions that we came up last week to Will directly. And we're very excited to hear from him. Without any further ado, here is Will Morris. Well, let's get started, Will. And first off, we always ask all of our guests, just how did you get your start into comics? Through reading, or were you a writer and then you saw this medium and decided to jump over there?
Yeah, absolutely through reading. Although it wasn't easy where I grew up because there was no comic shop as such. So I just had to kind of scrabble together what bits and pieces I could. I think it was, I'm trying to remember. I mean, obviously there's kind of Asterix and Tintin, kind of like, I guess, the cornerstones of anyone's comic reading, certainly of my age. But then I think it was coming across Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man was some of the first comics I'd read. And that, I guess, frenetic energy and athleticism was kind of what got me fired up as a very young person.
Yeah, so you're collecting a lot of those in like trade paperback then, probably.
Not back in those days, I guess.
So you were able to get a hold of single issues where you
I was getting single issues, but that was like I would have to travel. Well, it might not sound too exotic a distance to you, but like 40 miles to go to a comic shop. Maybe that's normal in the States. I'm not sure.
I'm sure there are parts of the States. You know, we live in a medium-sized city, and I think we've probably have 15 comic shops within.
Oh wow!
A 5-mile radius. So we're a little spoiled, but you know, I was in Copenhagen a couple years ago, and I thought, I'm here for a couple weeks. It'd be really cool if I could pick up some single issue comics. Nowhere in the entire city. As far as I could tell, nowhere in the country. I was like, if it were going to be in the country, it would be in Copenhagen.
Yeah, fair. I mean, I think you can, you know, in Paris, places like that, you can definitely get hold of them. But obviously they've got a completely different culture of comics over there.
Yes.
Which isn't really fueled by single issues, I guess, more of the albums. And but hey, I'm no expert, so I better not go too far down that.
Right. Yeah, no, I did think, you know, I'm sure in Denmark they probably also factor the sustainability of printing all the paper for single issue comics. And but you know, with the digital world, that's the great thing is we'll get to Gospel in just a moment, but that artwork alone on the front cover was a masterstroke because I picked it up because of that. And I went into a shop and I had a friend in the car with me and I said, hang on, I just need to run in here and pick up my pull list. And she went in and was just kind of nosing around, and out of the whole wall of comics, she picked up Gospel #1 because she just loved the art. So there's something really powerful about that. And then I know people who have picked it up digitally. You know, they were buying something else and it said, you know, Image comic readers who liked this book also read this, and they looked at the cover and they thought, oh, that looks nice.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that's probably the best decision I made throughout the entire process because it was Ver who created the covers. And I don't know if you've come across Ver's work before.
Only in the letter in the back of your issue.
Yeah. Yeah, Ver has done a fantastic comic called Wolf and Daughter, which is out through an independent publisher here in the UK called Quindry Press. And she's working on, they're working on a new graphic novel. And so I'm super excited about that because it's going to be phenomenal. Ver's work is extraordinary. So because I did, you know, I've kind of always considered myself like a sequential artist rather than like I didn't start kind of doing pin-ups or like comic designs or what have you. I started wanting to tell stories with panels. So I think it's such a skill in and of itself, telling a story and catching the eye on what's, as you say, like a super crowded shelf. And so I was like, I gave it a wee bit of a go, but I just thought I should see if Burr could step in there, because I'd seen their work at Edinburgh Comic Con a way back, and it was one of those ones probably similar to how you're describing, where I was walking past their table and I kind of rubbernecking just when I saw kind of the work on show and just how stunning it was. So I thought I'd chance my arm and see if they'd be interested in doing the covers.
Now, in the back of the first issue, you had what I think was basically you had done a mock-up of what you thought the cover would be, and then you gave that to Ver, and they, or was this Ver's prototype that is in the back here?
So Ver put together three different options, I think, for that first cover, and
it's extremely difficult choice. Yeah,
exactly. It was brutal, but I think I made the right one. And it was Ver's preference as well. And but then like that one was so stunning that going forward they didn't bother putting together three options. They're just like, this is the one, and we were like, yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, on the rooftop with the burning church is very, very tempting. But
yes,
since the story opens with the wild boar chase, it's a perfect segue into the story, and your expectations are met immediately. And then as soon as you think you know what kind of story you're in, you get a jarring shift to page 17. But again, so two questions from my co-host Alex, who was not able to make it today. And he was asking about your background. He opined that you're pretty well known in the British comic scene, very few appearances in the American comic scene. Hopefully that, is the trajectory that's changing. But he had noticed, and this is a classic Alex question. He said, how did you get involved with the Vertigo CMYK anthology, which I think he said was about 10 years ago? You were the artist for Night of the Black Stant, number 4.
Man, that's a deep pull. So
that's why Alex is on the podcast. I just like things. I read things and I like things and I want to talk about them. And he has the encyclopedic back knowledge.
Great days. Well, that was because I'd done a story in 2000 AD with David Bailey, who was the writer on that story, because David then went on to do a mini-series with Vertigo. And I think it was one of those, comics is so great for the people that are willing to say, oh, I've seen this person's work. Why not give them a shot to an editor or whoever else? And so many opportunities come through just people being generous and kind, rather than, you kind of hitting those kind of submissions at mailboxes or whatever else. So he had shown the work to one of the editors there, and they were keen to do that story. And that wasn't long before, I guess, a lot of change happened at Vertigo. So it would have been nice to kind of take that relationship further, but obviously it wasn't to be.
Well, Karen Berger now has her own imprint at Dark Horse, which is where we see a lot of the old Vertigo titles getting ported over.
Yeah,
like right. Error by Gio Willow Wilson is now being reprinted under the Berger Books imprint. So once they start making more original content at Berger, maybe you can say, hey, I almost had the traction going at Vertigo.
What a sell.
If we can hit resume on that would be great. Okay, the second question Alex had was, he said similarly, you did a single issue for Time Before Time, which was pretty current. And he said, what's it like coming into a series like that for just a one-shot appearance? I think number 24. Yeah,
that was a brilliant experience, to be honest, because I'd come hot off Making Gospel when that opportunity came up. I was just very fortunate that a friend was friends with Declan Shelby, and Declan just got in touch to say, would you be interested to kind of work on anything? And then a kind of a period of time elapsed, and then eventually this opportunity came up, and I was just thrilled, because honestly, working as the writer and artist on a series and working over quite an extended period of time where you're kind of juggling other responsibilities, it's incredibly rewarding, but also very hard work and quite grueling. And it's really nice to just draw, because this is what I kind of got into. What I always really aspired to do with comics was to just do the drawing part of things, and really the storytelling is something that came on later as I just started to understand what I wanted to draw, and that in some instances that was going to mean me writing the story in order to draw those things. So yeah, but it's a really great experience working, and just kind of having more restrictions and having that script and responding to that and seeing what you can do with that script and how you can stretch the storytelling and really kind of, I guess, bring through the themes in just, the visual aspect.
Yeah. Well, and that one, the character design is already done. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel there.
Yeah,
you're able to play with the pieces that are already on the board and push the story forward a little bit. So just out of curiosity, I was trying to do the math on this because I know each writer works at a different pace. Some of them can crank out a script a day, and some of them, each script takes a month. But I just saw a tweet from Jacob Phillips, the artist, and he was celebrating that he had a really good day because he inked 3 pages that day. And I thought,
I saw that tweet, and
did you?
Think what he said was penciled and inked.
Penciled and inked.
That made my heart stop.
Okay, and I was like, okay, well, now I'm thinking like, okay, most comic issues now about 24 pages. That's 8 work days, which is functionally 2 weeks of work for just the pencil and inking of one book. He didn't write that book. I assume it's the Enfield Massacre book he's working on right now. And I thought, okay, well, geez, if a script takes a week and penciling and inking takes a week and coloring took a week or two, that is a full month of 9 to 5 work for a single issue. In light of that, how long did Gospel take you?
Longer.
Well, yeah, and I'm sure you weren't dedicated 9 to 5 for a full month on each issue.
Yeah,
either.
I mean, I work part-time as a teacher, so I'm kind of balancing a couple of things whilst I'm kind of making comics.
Now, do you teach art or history?
Art.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a comic art course here in the UK.
Okay.
And yeah, I mean, honestly, yeah. So you're doing the maths there, but to me, 3 pages of pencils and 3 pages of inks in a day is the kind of pace I can't even begin to aspire to.
Well, his father's that way too.
Yeah,
Sean Phillips, like Ed Brubaker has said, the reason he writes so much is because Sean Phillips keeps demanding work. He comes back and says, "Hey, do you have anything else for me to draw?" And Ed's like, "Well, I haven't quite written that yet." So he's got a starving artist waiting for a script. Sure. Great motivation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And when it's a single vision like you're your own starving artist waiting for the script.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and the scripting did take a while because I was relatively new to writing. I'd written things. I'd written my first graphic novel, which was published about 10 years ago, was The Silver Darlings, and that was like I was about to say an adventure, but not really. I mean, it's like a story setting the herring fishing industry in Scotland, and that was really my first venture into longer form writing. And so after that, I was really conscious that I wanted to make sure that it had a structure and that it could kind of pull readers through the story with Gospel. So I did do a bit more investing in kind of understanding story structure and reading some of those kind of seminal books that kind of, I guess, are the foundation stones for a lot of storytelling. So that's completely off track from your original question. It takes a long time. It takes me, I think, I can probably do a page of pencils and inks in a day. 3 pages is kind of well beyond my capabilities at the moment. I need to employ some assistants or something that can do the backgrounds like a mangaka. But yeah, it was so yeah, probably talking about a page a day, and then I was also balancing other freelance projects. So it's probably like maybe 4 or 5 years actually, the full process of completing it whilst I was doing my other work and also balancing other kind of freelance projects as well.
Yeah, that's essentially what I would have guessed, which means
Mhm.
did you have the entire thing in hand when you went to Image, or did you have a couple finished issues and the full script and said, here's when I can deliver?
Yeah, no, not even that, to be honest. It was one of those kind of wonderful, unexpected experiences. I was at Thought Bubble Festival when I met Eric Stevenson, who was doing portfolio reviews for Image. And I just went with my portfolio. So, and it was the end of the day. He looked pretty exhausted. And he was flicking through it and he saw some of the stuff for the Silver Darlings, which is very different in style to Gospel. It's kind of, ink wash, a much rawer line. And I think he found it quite refreshing because he'd seen a lot of kind of superhero based content that day. And so to see something that was kind of quite distinctive and different was enough to get him interested. And then he flipped over and there were just 2 pages, 2 test pages of the very earliest idea of Gospel before I even knew what the overarching story was. And he was just interested in the feel of those pages and the way they were working. So he said, well, I like this, send me a synopsis and we'll see where we go from there. And so then I had to kind of just furiously put together a synopsis in the hope of kind of getting a series with Image. And it miraculously worked out. So it was good.
Yeah. Well, now that we're into Gospel, I've got 3 or 4 questions here about it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I ask something that you as the artist, you as the writer would rather have the reader continue to debate, feel free to opt out of answering any questions. But we get on page 17 by my count. We hear one of the first things Mr. Fisher says is that every storyteller has their purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'd love to talk about what Mr. Fisher's purpose is in storytelling and Pitt's purpose in storytelling. But I have to first turn, it feels negligent if I don't ask the meta question of what's your purpose in writing Gospel?
Yeah, that's very good. Taking it further than the layers that I've gone into in the story. Yeah, that is an interesting question. I mean,
well, was there a character you started with, or is there a particular commentary, or you'd always wanted to do a period piece?
I think it was a couple of things coming together at once. One, and that's how any story I ever have comes together. It's kind of maybe having an experience or reading up on something or visiting somewhere and just like a place or a setting or an era kind of getting lodged in my head and then combining that with something I'm feeling or experiencing in kind of like the modern times. So with Gospel, it was just on like a family holiday, like many moons ago in Devon, which is in the southwest of England. If you've not been there, there was this church which is honestly the most brutal, weather-beaten church you're ever likely to see on this kind of craggy rock. And to think of people having to go up there every Sunday, I mean, I feel for those folk because it would have been brutal. But there was a legend attached to it of the devil and St. Michael like in combat over the fate of this church, and I just liked it, and I liked it because I mean it was such a stark looking church. I really love drawing those pieces with that kind of church atop this kind of craggy rock face. So it was partly that. It was partly then kind of doing, because I was living in that area at the time, doing a lot of reading around kind of local folk tales. And, you kind of read them and they're fascinating stories, but sometimes without the cultural context, it's hard to understand what was the purpose of this story. Was it just to entertain? Did it have like a moral message? Did it have something, that would help the community kind of bind together and learn, through that kind of passed down wisdom? And some of them are just so obscure and weird that you'd really kind of grapple with like, what on earth was the purpose of this story? And so I had those two things knocking around in my head, just kind of whirring around. And at the same time, when I was kind of writing it, like Instagram, or when I was kind of just mulling it over, Instagram was, becoming huge, and social media more broadly, and this kind of pressure to present almost like an idealized version of who you are.
Yeah.
And people kind of putting up this facade, I guess, in some respects, because no one's life is perfect or idealized. So combining those aspects, which might sound super disparate, is kind of how the story emerged, because you have Mathilde, who's trying to kind of establish herself as like the hero of legend, to be the person that's celebrated by communities, and to be that person that's presenting an idealized version of themselves. And they're doing so by slightly
racketeering is the word that came to mind for me. Yeah.
Yeah, nefarious means. So it's kind of, you have that view of where she wants to be and the idealized view. But then I also wanted to tell a story where I took this very old story of this battle over a church and tried to give it some of that contemporary context, something that had some meaning to people now, which would be about kind of, maybe kind of empathy and kind of leaning into friendships and finding belonging that way is more important than the admiration of strangers,
Yeah, no, that's great. And to be fair, that sounded, you said it, it was a tricky question or whatever. And I think the story that I heard was that the whole Harry Potter series came about because JK was riding on a train through Scotland and thought, what if this was a setting? Like, what if a boy was riding to a school here? And everything else, which is the most incidental part of the story.
Yeah, totally.
But that was what, that's all you need is a little seed to touch the soil. And sometimes things start to bloom.
Totally. Well, I was just reading, like one of the big inspirations for the book was, I don't know if you can see it up here.
I can see it. I can't read it.
It's Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind.
Okay.
The Hayao Miyazaki manga.
Oh, yeah.
And I was just reading an interview with him today, actually, on the process of creating this, which sounds like it was an excruciating experience over 10 plus years. But it's really interesting because he was talking about how when he started writing it, he didn't set out with, this is how it ends. These are the themes I want to explore. And he grew and evolved over that 10-year period of writing, and had kind of like a love-hate relationship with the book. And the story evolved as he kind of wrote it. And I think that is, it's good to have like a sense of where it ends and maybe what you want to say. But I think it's lovely to be able to let the characters evolve and develop over the process of making that story.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the next thing that we debated, which you kind of hinted at already, is in our discussion, which we already recorded so that we couldn't sound really enlightened and discuss it after speaking to the author. Yeah. So that will come out, I think, September 7th, and this will be the 14th.
Cool.
And in our discussion, we were debating whether there's, a particular meaning in that historical setting, which obviously there is because it came from, the plaque outside the church, or whether it happened to be a pivotal moment in mass communication, which is a central theme of the book, which is, yes, once the printing press has reached the dissemination of information, good and bad information goes out rapidly, which is very similar to the age we're in now. It sounded like you were talking about it more on the personal level, what each person chooses to do with that in terms of how they depict themselves online, whether they're creating this mythic version of themselves. So didn't know if it was meant to have two layers there, one on the kind of the mass level of like, as soon as it hits England, people factionalize. There's a papist and the reformers. And wow, if we could funnel everything into two groups these days, that would be a monumental achievement. But as soon as anyone gets online access, it's bam, new faction.
Yeah, true. No,
so
that's a really good point. And it's definitely part of it as well. And I think another reason why I felt that era was particularly relevant is because probably as it has ever been, like it felt like a period where technology was advancing at a rate that like human structures weren't ready to deal with.
Yeah.
which feels again very similar to where we are now, and whether it's whether it is the effect of social media on like people's interactions and connection, or whether it is AI or whatever else, it feels like things are kind of hurtling at a pace that society's not quite ready for. And I think that was very much the case with the advent of the printing press, as you say, and particularly for the priest character in the book, who is used to having almost total control over hearts and minds as the person who is the conduit between the people and God and their religion, which at that time would have been everything, as part of their daily lives and rituals. And so to be in a position where suddenly you're no longer to some extent you're no longer that person that's interpreting and influencing and having control over a group, because they've got ready access and can kind of get closer to their kind of faith or beliefs through their kind of own reading, was a really interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that in that day, prior to the English Reformation, there would be essentially one Bible per town. It would be chained to the pulpit, and it would be in Latin. And I mean, English literacy wasn't extremely high, but Latin literacy was basically priesthood only.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the translation of prayer books and Bibles probably gave a boost to that literacy as well in time. Sure. But yeah, not everyone was on board for that.
Yeah. I had heard this quote somewhere, but I think it was Martin Luther said at one point that he was referring to his own translating the Bible into German, and he said that it would open a floodgate of iniquity, and if it does do that, then so be it, because it's better to give people direct information and sort it out, basically, than it is to keep everything tied to one figure who's corruptible. So we rather trust the corrupt nature of the masses rather than corrupt central figure of authority. So kind of a fascinating decision, and that's I think telling it in this context, in the historical setting, gives you kind of the 2020 hindsight. Whereas if you were telling a modern story about how in America 50 years ago there were 3 sources of news, and it was 3 over-the-air channels, and now there are thousands of news websites and a lot of cable news options, and so now people can choose the news and information that suits them rather than going through one of the 3 sanctioned voices. And we don't actually know what the end result of that is going to be yet. We're starting to see some troubling signs of what it might be, but when we look at the 16th century Reformation, we're like, we have a pretty good idea how that ended.
That's very true.
I mean, we're still, in a sense, in the unfolding of that, but we have a much clearer picture of what's it going to look like 100 years after these massive changes. So just a brilliant choice. And speaking of the context, I think it was notable and had to be intentional that your 2 protagonists were a black male teenager or young adult and a white female teenager or young adult, who don't frequently make the headlines in this period of time.
No.
And so it's difficult for me not to interpret that as the way that we mythologize stories and tell history is often very selective with race and gender.
Yes.
Can you speak to that at all? Was that part of the thinking? Was that all the thinking?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, I think, and at the end of the book, there's kind of it's only really one panel, but it's kind of revealed how, in a sense, Mathilde got her wish. She gave rise to a story that has passed down through the generations, but actually it's attributed to Saint Michael rather than being attributed to her. And yeah, so absolutely that's the case. I mean, more than anything, I just wanted to write a story with the characters I wanted to write, and I wanted that to be reflective of the world I live in, not the world that like some people would have you believe that history,
Sure.
historic populations lived in. But I think it did mean also doing a lot of research just to make sure that what the story I was telling was plausible, even if it's a work of historical fantasy, which it absolutely is. That it was plausible, and that there's kind of a good basis there for kind of these characters, and kind of so that meant doing a lot of reading just on kind of the roles of Black people in Tudor England, which was maybe enlightened, it's not the right word, but was kind of a much more not egalitarian, that's a terrible word as well, but was kind of people of different races occupied almost any role you could imagine, which might not have been the case even in the centuries that followed the Tudor period.
Interesting.
And and the same again, obviously I was actually really just fortuitous. It was after Gospel got published, but I just read a book called Femina, I think it is, which tries to, or Femina, I might get the pronunciation wrong, but that is looking at the early Middle Ages through the lenses of the women that shaped history, just as a way of trying to just kind of reframe kind of how we perceive the past and the influential people within it.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I just pulled up that book. It's a HarperCollins book.
Yeah, it's really great, actually. Really good read.
I will warn our listeners, it does not have pictures. That is a lot of what we cover on the podcast.
It does have pictures, yeah.
Okay. It's
just not sequential art. So
okay, yes, okay. Yeah, good distinction.
With that.
Well, you stumbled a little bit there on the genre. You almost called it historical fiction, and then you called it historical fantasy. And I actually wanted to ask what the genre is. I think the book is left open to some interpretation. When you grab the front cover, you think historical fantasy. This is going to be, kings and castles and, mutant-sized boars. And then you get these demonic things, and you get teased a magical hammer. And almost all of that is stripped away because we realize, like, oh, the boar was a normal-sized boar. They're trying to spin a story here. The hammer was just a regular hammer. It was just the hammer used for that purpose. The demons are just the priest dressed up. However, she does talk to a ghost, which...
Yeah, what does she?
Exactly. The fact that the whole genre now comes down to, well, was she really talking to a ghost or not? And so I think that's very clever. That I think one person could read it and say, oh, it demythologized, it took the varnish off, and we see that it is actually just historical fiction. And someone else could read it and still say, no, there are fantasy elements here. So is it your intention to leave it open to guessing, or is there something fantasy intrinsic to the plot?
Yeah, no, I did want people to be able to interpret it how they will, because I think that's the very nature of stories, is that yes. Like one person will read certain events differently to another person. So for instance, with the kind of the meeting the ghost, I think maybe I'm too subtle with it, or I kind of didn't layer enough panels, but like
that'd be issue 4.
Yeah, I think it might be start of issue 5 maybe.
Okay.
Where she kind of like lays her head down to have a rest. So
yes.
So
yep.
You could, but just
her
just
head
for a
is
single
definitely
panel.
Down. Yep.
And so it, and then she kind of readopts the same position kind of later on. So it's kind of up to you to decide, did she have an interaction with a spirit, or is it a dream? And they're kind of like, I guess I've got a point of view, but I'd be happy for anyone to interpret it however they like. And
and that's what I was saying very early in the podcast. I said, some authors don't like talking about their point of view because they don't want to make an official point of view, because it feels like you're taking something away from the reader. So I want to leave you that freedom, but I will absorb as much as you can, and I have thick enough skin as a reader that, and I'm pig-headed enough that I will disagree with you about your own work if I feel really strongly about an interpretation.
Yeah, let's get to blows. No. So, I mean, I would definitely say it's historical fantasy because it's like, but maybe not, high fantasy. Kind of more like low fantasy.
Yeah.
So it's kind of grounded in most ways, but of course, there's kind of wild action and explosions and all the kinds of things that might not happen on a day-to-day basis in a 16th century town in England.
Sure.
So yeah, it's definitely fantasy in terms of the action and adventure, I guess, within there.
If nothing else, I think probably the blue hair in the 16th century.
Yeah, I mean, I did actually think about that because this is where I was thinking.
I didn't bump on it the first time through. Like, it didn't even register to me as odd. And then I noticed that, like when we have her flashback sequences to her birth, her hair color is the tint that kind of washes over the page, which I thought it's brilliant storytelling when you don't have to clue people in as to what they're seeing and they pick it up through little subversive things like that.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you. Well, I think I was thinking the kind of person she is, she wants to live long in people's memories. So she wants to create a brand almost. So I guess the way I envisioned it, I don't know how. This is obviously where I probably should have done more research, but like that she would use dyes or lichen or something like that to kind of give her hair the tint, so that anyone that's retelling a story about her would, of course, first mention this kind of shock of green-blue hair as a calling card for her. So even though I don't kind of really go on to explain that in the book, other than for Pitt at the very end to say, so you're keeping the hair, it's kind of like this is about her trying to like pitch herself as this larger than life, like more than basically.
And I think that becomes pretty evident for if you're paying attention as a reader, because it just fits with everything about her. So here's an odd question, and I think this is probably the strangest question you're going to be asked.
I'm excited.
Who is the main character? Is it Mr. Fisher or is it Mathilde?
I think it's unquestionably in my heart it's Mathilde. And
because it'd be strange if it were Mr. Fisher because he's not even in the second and fourth issue.
Yeah.
However,
that's a bad way to write a protagonist.
Well, he is the one narrating. That's my understanding. Is everything we're getting about Mathilde and Pitt is through Mr. Fisher's point of view, and which that's like saying, have you ever seen the Tim Burton movie Big Fish?
Do you know? It's funny you mentioned that because I remember talking to a friend about it before it even got started as a proper book, and we came to this conclusion that it was, how everyone like pitches a book as X meets X.
Yes, yeah.
That it was like Lord of the Rings meets Big Fish.
That's exactly
was the pitch back in the day. The Lord of the Rings bit is a bit of a stretch, but
I think it's just this does not strike me as Middle Earth. So wait, so have you seen the movie, or is that just something somebody? Okay, because
I really enjoyed it actually.
That to me was the comparison where it's like, well, I mean, technically, Ewan McGregor is unquestionably the main character. He's playing a younger version of the old man who's telling these stories, but the old man isn't actually the main character, even though the framing device is using him to tell the stories. It's about the young character, and ultimately it's about his son, and so there are all these different vantage points. But the person with the most screen time is Ewan McGregor's character, who is living in flashback, and they're partially fantasized flashbacks because it communicates the true essence of what happened. And I love that his son became a journalist because he wants the facts only. And then he's he's sitting with his father at his deathbed. They're recounting the stories, and he goes to the funeral, and he realizes like, oh, these people were actually quite a bit more real than I realized. The embellishing was not as extreme as I thought. He just knew how to spin a good story. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of thought, oh, that's what Mr. Fisher's doing. So, okay. So Mathilde's absolutely a main character. And I agree with you. So I have two more questions.
Yeah, sure.
The first, my co-host stumped me in the middle of our episode talking about this, but we were, I don't know, 3/4 of the way through, and he said, what do you think of the name of it? Why is it called Gospel? And I have a background in theology. He doesn't have any background in theology. And so he expected me to have a better answer. And I said, I don't know. I said, I just kind of accepted it. And, there's like the modern parlance of calling something gospel truth, which would mean, I think people use that to mean literally true, like word for word true. And I was like, well, I certainly don't think that's what it means, but I think it's maybe like a lowercase g, as in it's like, this is how things are mythologized. This is how they evolve. And this is how stories convey meaning, regardless of how precisely they describe the, events perfect. So anyway, that was our wild speculation. Set us straight.
I think you've done a pretty good job there, Mike, to be honest. Yeah, I think, I suppose that I think that you're right. Gospel truth is essentially kind of, it came from that sentiment alongside obviously the fact that it's kind of set around a period of sort of religious turmoil and kind of like the Gospels being kind of cornerstones of I guess the old traditional faith. But I think, yeah, definitely it was that idea of the truth. What is the truth, and whose truth? And can there ever be a gospel truth, as it were, when it comes to telling stories? Because as Mr. Fisher says, everyone's got their purpose, and every storyteller, whether it is like, whether it's just purely to entertain or whether they're trying to influence the people that are listening in a certain way, everyone's got a purpose in the stories they tell. So, and same with any kind of news media outlet, the way in which they will interpret the same events will, have a very different spin, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, and it's just fascinating to me because it fits so well that I didn't think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, there's a religious setting to the story, but it is in no way a religious story.
No, that was kind of an interesting one, because I wanted to try and be sensitive there, because it's a tricky thing, right? I mean, obviously, it's been several centuries since the English Reformation, so
some people aren't over it yet. So
that's true. I mean, that's true.
So yeah.
So, but yeah, I mean, because I grew up in a Catholic background, so like not that my family, well, not that my sort of parents were like practicing as such, but I went to Catholic school, and so you get surrounded with all the kind of the rituals, the guilt complexes, the way of life, and just like all of those things, and so what I hope is that, because there's arguments in both directions. There's never there's never a clean answer to anything as complex as changing someone's entire way of life or belief system. And so I never wanted to or intended to kind of make a stance on whether one was right or wrong, only that within any system there are people that can be corrupted by the power their position affords them.
Well, and the beautiful thing of your two main young characters are on opposite sides of this debate, yet they are best friends. And it's like, things like this do not have to drive schisms between, neighbor and family member. It is
Yeah,
only
true.
when we choose to elevate the importance of these things over our relationships that they become,
Yeah.
divisive.
And it's that's probably only because it's fresh in my mind, but that Miyazaki interview I was reading as well, he was describing how I think he had been kind of a real maybe Marxist or when he was kind of growing up, and that his kind of political views had shifted away, not away to the other side of the political spectrum, but to the point where he's not any longer kind of like assessing people on what's whether they're right or wrong, only whether they're nice, you
Yeah,
know,
right.
and whether it's someone that he would want to spend time with rather than someone that shares a specific viewpoint.
Yeah. So he changed the way he holds his view, not necessarily the view he holds. And
Yeah,
I think
yeah, very true, very true.
that's the real mark of maturity is that
Uh-huh.
uh, you know, regardless of your view, how do you hold it? How do you treat other people as a result of your view? And people with different views. Okay, so I hate to sprinkle more American pop culture references,
No, hit me.
but yeah, I already got you with Big Fish. And
Yes.
so I had this Big Fish thing. Alex and I were both puzzled by the final page of the book,
Mm-hmm.
where the caseworker looks around, you see the boar's head, you see the picture of the two kids, you see the church, you see the cards, you see the hat, you see the sculpture, you see the hammer, and you see the Hamlet quote, "To that end self be true." Um, and so you see all of this. I took that as he's collected these relics of things that are the story is very important to him, and he's filled his house with these things. Alex read it a completely different way. He read this as the movie The Usual Suspects uh,
Okay.
with Kaiser Soze, who the entire movie he's being interrogated. Spoiler alert for a movie from 1996. He's been interrogated by the police this whole time, and he's spinning them this story. And as soon as he walks out, the detective looks around and realizes, like, oh, he was just grabbing things in the room and spinning a story out of the things that he could see and piecing them together, and then walking free. And Alex thought, oh, this clever old guy was just telling her a long story to waste her time and was just looking around seeing a boar's head. So now I'm going to tell a story about a boar's head. And here's, this hammer sitting in a bucket. So here's a mythical hammer. And I was like, I really like that, but I don't think that's what it was going for. Especially since she ends feeling very positive about the whole exchange. But either way, it felt like the last page was meant to provide closure, but we both felt like, ooh, it actually twists the knife a little bit and has you thinking about the ending rather than giving you a nicely buttoned up ending.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about your intentions with the final page of the
Yeah,
book.
yeah, it's really interesting to hear those two viewpoints, and I think I was always, if I was to kind of revisit the book, I think those kind of modern day sections are the area I'd probably try and find more time for in the story, and to sort of flesh those out. But I'm not at all disappointed if people have different ways of interpreting it and take different things away from that. And so I guess my question is, do you want to know what my intention was
I do.
specifically?
Yeah, I do.
You do?
And we
Okay.
can tell people to skip forward 90 seconds or
Okay,
whatever if they don't
cool.
want to hear it.
So my intention was very much Alex's perspective on that.
Wow. Okay.
So I
Okay, so
suppose the
the only thing that I found that supported that, by the way, is that it's technically an anachronism for her to have "To Thine Own Self Be True" when she's born 13 years before Hamlet was written.
exactly,
I didn't
yeah.
know if that was intentional, but it's okay.
I mean that would be next level. I don't know. Yeah, I think that was just me freestyling with.
Well, you can take credit for it now. Yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose the kind of the arc there is in the very first scene, with features in the modern day. The social worker has kind of has visited because there's reports from kind of around the village or whatever else that this person is not living a decent life or whatever in their cottage or whatever, or that they need to go into assisted living or something along those lines. So she's trying to do an appraisal on that basis. Right. And he's really elusive with facts because he thinks he can convince her better that he should stay in that house by telling this story rather than just giving her the facts that she's looking for to complete her form, which wouldn't paint a full picture of who this man is. So, and what he needs. So if on page, let me see if I can grab this.
The pages are not numbered, which artistically I like for the purposes of this podcast.
It's not ideal, is it?
It's not ideal because we very much have a book club style. No, it's better. I can add numbers if I feel like it.
Okay. So here we go. So we've got this page. So it's on the third page of the modern scene.
At the very beginning.
Yeah, the very beginning.
Okay. So that'd be probably page 17 is the first page of the modern thing. So that'd be page 19 or 20.
Yeah. So she says, have you considered whether someplace else might be more comfortable, a nice airy residential home, for instance?
Mm-hmm.
And he replies, oh my no, this place is my imagination, my soul. I'd be lost without it. And so then he is, as Alex says, he's trying to convince her of how important this home is to him and that he shouldn't be moved to a residential home. And so that's where he tells this tall tale, much like Big Fish. And then at the very end, it's only that she notices all of these artifacts that are pivotal in the telling of this story. And these are really just kind of accumulated detritus from his life, essentially, but that they kind of, she realizes that like, this is his heart, this is his soul, this is kind of where he needs to be, because this is kind of, you know, where he gets his character and his inspiration and whatever else from. So, I mean, I hate to say it, but Alex got it on the head there.
Yeah, that's great. By the way, are there changes from the single issue to the trade?
Yeah, there is.
Okay, I was like, I have the single issue open on my computer, and I'm holding the trade open, and I was like, wait, what? This is...
yeah.
And I kept referring to it as the last page because I was in single issue. That's not the last. This is the second to last page now, because the last page is now this big splash with the framed picture, which to me, moving that from a small panel to a full page is much more the Kaiser Soze, because it's like there's no way it's a photograph of these two kids in the story. These are kids in the neighborhood that he's inserted into the story, you know, or something like that, or his granddaughter, something.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, could be any relation, but yeah, I think that was a really interesting, because I spoke to the editor Sebastian Gerner just like about, okay, I've got this opportunity to make any small changes if I want to, just to kind of smooth things along. So there are a few subtle things that are tweaked between the single issues and the trade paperback, so but that's the most significant one.
Sure,
and I think we both
huge.
Felt that, as you say earlier on, I felt, even though, you have this framing device and he's very much the narrator, this is Matilda's story and it's Pitt's story, and to finish on them and to make that much more significant, that photograph, that this is clearly the two characters from the book, from the story, even if they're not in a Tudor setting, that helps that kind of final scene resonate a bit harder and just finishes on the two main characters, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, so you had to draw that whole extra page after after you thought you were finished with the book, and then it looks like let's see, you got you added this Tudor England book as the
what did I do? What did
the second one there? You moved to Thine Own Self Be True up to the first row from the third row. So lots of little changes that I feel just flabbergasted that I missed that until I'm talking to you in real time.
Yeah, well,
but I've never had them both open at the same time before. I did my initial read in single issue, and then I read again in trade, and now I've been referencing single issue.
Yeah, I guess I kind of, I almost assume they're going to be a different readership. It's probably fairly rare that people have both to hand. So,
well, it's a sickness that's exclusive to this podcast. Yeah, Alex did this. For another book that we did earlier this summer, Outpost Zero, he found some discrepancy between the single issue and I was reading the compendium. And it's always fascinating when that happens. This doesn't feel like, I think the bad example of when that happens is like George Lucas constantly retweaking 4, 5, and 6. And
please don't brand me George Lucas.
Right. And his he never has a definitive version of it. Whereas this is a very logical change. It's a, coherent storytelling change. And I think kind of tips the hand from ambiguity to a little more resolution.
Mm-hmm.
But with it not being, Mr. Fisher's book, it doesn't fundamentally change anything. I mean, I think, Matilda's story is still exactly what it was. And her character arc and journey are the same. This just gives us a little more closure on the modern leg of the story.
So. And I think it's still, like I say, I think it's still open to interpretation. I mean, I welcome it. People have got different points of view, please. And,
Yeah, I mean, as long as people are talking about your book, that means they're reading it, right? Yeah. Okay, well, that was the last question we have. I told you it would take an hour, and we're right up against that. But the last thing we like to ask is, first of all, is there anything coming up soon that we should be on the lookout for? People, definitely the host of this podcast, we do basically, once we've covered a book, we essentially have a pull list for that author. It's like everything you have your name on now. Obviously, Alex can dig up anything you've ever touched. So just be careful there. And then finally, is there another way that people are to support you? Do you sell original art pages? Do you have a Patreon or Kickstarter or anything like that?
I mean, mostly just follow, if you like the art, if you like the storytelling, please do follow on Instagram, where I'm Will H. Morris, and whatever alias Twitter's going by today, I'm WH_Morris. So yeah, it'd be lovely to see folks there. And I do kind of share kind of more work in progress stuff. Other than that, I probably will get around to selling some original art, but I'll probably just do that through my website, which is whmorris.com at some point. I've just kind of not got that figured out just yet.
Yeah, well, I've got a whole wall of original art, so I love collecting it, and as soon as it's for sale,
who have you got on there?
Oh, well, so my all-time favorite artist storyteller is Jeff Lemire.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a full watercolored page from Royal City over there. I've got a Matt Kint page here from Mind Management. I've got some Jorge Jimenez from Batman.
Nice.
I have a page from the book White, which was the sequel to Black. I have a Tyler Heller Jenkins from the new book Hairball. I'm a big cat person. It's their new horror book. Matt Kint has his own imprint at Dark Horse now. And then one of our favorite series of all time is The Unwritten, my Mike Carey and Peter Gross. I have 2 pages of that M.K. Perker did. I'm trying to get a hold of a Peter Gross one. He and I have an email thread going back and forth since February, where he has encouraged me to nag him every week because one of the page I want from the book, he hasn't finished yet. The book came out.
Interesting.
Yeah, he said I had to send it off because there was a deadline, and then he had I think his daughter finished it digitally. But the original print in his house, he wants to finish the inking before he sends it to me. And I'm like, at this point, it's like, I don't know. It's like 12, 15 years later now. I'm like, just give it to me in whatever form it is. I'll pay for it, ship it. So anyway,
it'd be good to scrutinize that artwork, kind of like the idealized version of that artwork versus.
I know, yeah, to me, it's like whatever you have. Well, he said well, the lettering's not on, and I'll add the lettering. I was like, well, you don't have to. You didn't do the lettering for the book, so I don't know, why you did the lettering. By the way, did you do the lettering in Gospel?
Yes, yeah, okay. I think I did pretty much everything in there.
Yeah, well, often these solo projects, they still, like Jeff Lemire will write the story, tell the story, draw it, ink it, color it, and still have someone come in and finish the letters, like the underwater welder or something. But
you know what? I would have liked. I'm really pleased with how the colors turned out. But initially, I'd intended to get a colorist, and I would have liked to have got a letterer as well. I think just as the months wore on and the budget kind of contracted, just those sort of opportunities shrank a bit. So yeah, I wound up colouring it myself, which was hard work, but I'm really glad I did because I'm pleased with how it turned out.
Yeah, well, and the lettering looks great. I would never know that wasn't someone who specialized in lettering. And yeah, my only complaint with the lettering was, every once in a while, a letterer will like emphasize a word and make it bold. And I would have loved on that last page if you'd emphasize the word fresh on teabag. Since we saw his collection of heavily recycled tea bags in the kitchen.
Oh, yeah, you're right.
And she was totally grossed out. And so she said, yeah, I'll be sure to check in soon. Please send me a fresh tea bag.
Damn.
That's how I read it anyway.
Look, if there's ever a second printing, I'll
it's
make
really
that
not worth it.
No, you can have a credit, man. That is a good suggestion.
Well, yeah, I loved it because I had a roommate in grad school that had tea bags like Mr. Fisher because, we were both absolutely impoverished. But I was like, I don't care where I am in my life. I can afford new tea bags. So anyway, well, thank you so much for talking. We really appreciate it. We will have links to your website, your Instagram, and whatever the website, Twitter happens to be at the time in our show notes. So whether you're listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever, you can just click directly from the episode description, get there. And thank you again, Will, for chatting with us.
Thank you, Mike. It was a real pleasure. Thank you.